Started slowly with a welcome and a few logistics. Then I'll introduce Margo and we can get started straight away. Uh, Welcome to the 2021 Oregon Active Transportation Summit. Hard to believe this is the 10th annual event, but time passes quickly. My name is Sarah Iannarone. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Executive Director of the Street Trust. Before we begin our program, I want to acknowledge that the land I'm standing on, the Portland metro area, rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalaupua, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. This session is called Mobility, Equity, and Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Your presenter is Margo Hill. ASL interpretation is provided by Stellar Communication. To ensure you can see the ASL, please hover over the interpreter's video and select Pin in the menu under the three blue dots in the right-hand corner. Our interpreters will switch off every 15 minutes or so you'll want to repin them when they do that. Please type your questions into the chat or use the raise hand tool, both of which can be found at the bottom of your screen. This is a pretty full presentation, so unless it's a technical or clarifying question, if you could hold your questions to the end for the Q&A period, that would be very helpful. Please use the social media hashtag OATS21 to post about this session or the summit on your social media. And don't forget this afternoon at 2, we have Poison Waters, famous Portland drag queen, doing bingo with us this afternoon for our last social hour session of the summit. So I hope you can join us for that. And I also wanted to remind you to visit the Street Trust website at streettrust.org to learn about SB 395, which is a update to the historic bike bill on its 50th anniversary that the Street Trust is championing in the Oregon legislature this session to increase funding for bicycle and pedestrian safety. Finally, to claim AICP credit for attending the session, please log into the OATS SCED platform and find the AICP certificate download near the top of the page. So without further delay, we want to welcome Margo Hill. Margo is an associate professor at Eastern Washington University, a Spokane tribal member who grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. She serves as the associate director of Small, Urban, Rural, and Tribal Center on Mobility, CERTCOM. Dr. Hill served as the Spokane tribal attorney for over 10 years and as a Coeur d'Alene tribal court judge. In this capacity, she received letters of declination from the U.S. Attorney's Office and worked to bring perpetrators to justice in the complex criminal law scheme of Indian country. Margo, Dr. Hill, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to learn from you today.
Heo putis kasihu putis quali putis lachlacht Luis Quest Margo Hill. Hello and good day. Thank you all for joining our session. It is my pleasure to share with you. I'm coming from Spokane, Washington, the ceded territory and homelands of the Spokane, the Spokane tribal people. And it's with great pleasure that I share with you about mobility, equity, and murdered missing Indigenous women. As Sarah mentioned, I served as the Spokane Tribe's attorney and had a legal practice. I'm a licensed attorney. I also have a master's in urban regional planning and work within the field of transportation. So I'm real excited to be part of OATS this year. And I also acknowledge that when I talk about issues, I talk about it from a third generation Indigenous history speaking Native. I have pictures of my mother, my grandmother, my great grandmother, as well as my family as we gathered at the banks of the Spokane River. I claim my grandmothers, my yayas and my tupias, great grandmothers, as my sources of authority when it comes to issues of mobility and of Indigenous women. So there are tribes throughout the inland Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. In Washington, we have 29 tribes. So anywhere you go as a transportation planner, as a planning professional, you will likely be working with tribes, whether it's helping tribes design roundabouts, working with the tribal community for a state highway or right-of-way. There's a good chance that you'll be working with tribes. A lot of tribes have lands off their ceded or in their ceded territories that are not located specifically on the reservation, because of course, everywhere we stand is Indian country. Everywhere we stand is Indigenous land. So I'm going to do a little bit of background and teach you some Indian law and federal Indian law and jurisdiction, a little bit of federal Indian policy, because you cannot really do good planning in Indian country without understanding American Indian history, understanding concepts of tribal sovereignty, and understanding the preemption of state laws in the field of Indian affairs. So European governments really presuppose their right to take the New World from its original habitants. They found justification in Christian evangelism, Roman law of conquest, and the international law of the day. So what are the sources of federal Indian law? Where does it come from? And of course, I teach federal Indian law over 3 months, and it's a very complex area of the law. So I'm just giving you a quick abbreviated snapshot. But I believe that you will understand more when you understand where federal Indian law comes from, really the source and the foundation. So it comes from international law practice. We look to borrowed and settled principles of international law, Roman law, land title of European governments, Spanish law of conquest. Also, inherent tribal sovereignty, the inherent right or power to govern. At the time that European came to America, tribes were very sovereign by nature and necessity. They conducted their own affairs, and they depended on no outside source of power to legitimize their acts of government. Treaties, many of us are familiar with the term. There are 369 treaties that were entered into with the United States of America and tribal communities, tribal governments. Another source of federal Indian law, federal statutes. Statutes, of course, are enacted by Congress. There are some laws that are enacted by Congress specifically to apply to Indian tribes, such as the Indian Child Welfare Act or the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. Other statutes, we consider whether they apply based on general applicability rules. Next, executive orders. Some tribes don't have a treaty, but rather they have an executive order, which is a unilateral agreement entered into with the president, typically that establishes a reservation. This is opposed to treaties that's kind of a bilateral agreement between the tribe and the United States. And I'm going to talk a little bit about treaties as we go along. Federal court decisions. There are a lot of decisions that are made in federal courts that apply to tribes in Indian country. And so we want to be careful that when we bring a case, that it's a good case, because bad facts make bad law, and it applies to all the tribes. Administrative regulations. So sometimes it's federal agencies that make laws and they apply to Indian country. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency puts forth regulations that apply to tribes. One that we study all the time, but we might not be familiar with, the United States Constitution. In the United States Constitution, we have the Indian Commerce Clause, the Treaty Clause, the Supremacy Clause, which states that federal laws are supreme over state laws. And this has to deal with federal Indian law, Federal government, states, foreign nations, and tribes recognizing the separate sovereigns. And this will be part of the reason that we exclude state laws from Indian country. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. And then lastly, tribal law. Each tribes across the United States, they enact a constitution or bylaws. They have their own tribal law and order code, own statutes, own resolutions. This is internal law that applies to each of the tribe and its own members. And there are traditional tribal examples, like the Tlinkits have a very highly evolved traditional property law. So for you to understand a little bit about mobility and equity and murdered, missing Indigenous women, it's important for you to understand the layers of jurisdiction and the layers of law that are in play in Indian country. This is partly why we have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, because you have these layers of law that apply in Indian country. So this is a picture of the Colville Indian Reservation. It's 1.4 million acres, located kind of in northeastern Washington. The tribe has a layer of tribal laws. If there are non-Indians that reside within the reservation boundaries, then state law applies. And then if there are major crimes, then federal laws apply. And I will break these down and explain these scenarios individually. So for you to understand a little bit about federal Indian law, murdered, missing Indigenous women, and I think we have somebody admitting folks to the room. I don't know if I'm supposed to click that. But to understand the problem of missing, murdered Indigenous women, you have to understand a little bit about land tenure. So this is a map of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So as many tribes, you can see this original boundary, the dotted line of 1855, that was the original boundary. Of course, as many tribes, the United States government only carried out half of their promise. So as settlers were moving into this territory, they took back a significant portion of which the tribe understood was going to be their reservation. Often these are sacred waterways and lands that we include as part of ceding our territory. Unfortunately, the Umatillas were deprived of almost half, a little less than half of their reservation. This, the reservation that's currently still today's reservation, outlined by the kind of the orange part that you can see here, has different titles, different land tenure, titles, and status of ownership. So you have tribal trust land that's in the blue, you have tribal fee land that's in the orange, and then you have non-Indian fee land that's in the cream color. This is the status of many Indian reservations. It's called checkerboard reservation, meaning you have a parcel that's Native owned, Indian owned, you have a parcel that's non-Native owned. It makes it very difficult to regulate Indian country for planners, for transportation, and for other mobility issues, to regulate issues when the land tenure is so complex and complicated. Because as you'll see, for each of those land tenures, there are different types of laws that apply depending on the situation, depending on the possibility of a crime. So just to kind of give you a slice, there are, and this is from our friend Raquel Kelly Myers. She's the staff attorney for the National Indian Justice Center. I really like her image of how this kind of breaks down. So everything matters in Indian country. Who owns the land? So you're looking at the land ownership status. Rights of way, is there documentation? as I mentioned, I served as the Spokane Tribes Attorney for over 10 years, and often right-of-ways were not legally obtained. Maybe the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal agency, granted the state or the United States some kind of right-of-way, but didn't actually have a resolution from tribal council. And so it's an illegal land grant of this right-of-way. And this happens throughout Indian country. There are lots of right-of-way issues. Anybody from probably Oregon Department of Transportation that might be on has examples throughout the different reservations they work on. So enforcement, just basic enforcement of the different types of road users. Who's the offender? Are they Indian or are they non-Indian? And then looking at civil regulatory jurisdiction. If it's a tribal person, tribal law and order codes come into play. Civil adjudicatory jurisdiction, if we're looking at speeding and different issues, again, these are all transportation issues that come into play and call into question federal laws, state laws, and who has jurisdiction. Lastly, criminal jurisdiction. Again, tribal courts are divested of jurisdiction over non-Indians. Based on the United States Supreme Court case, the Oliphant, tribal governments do not have jurisdiction over criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. And this is a real problem. So why do we care? Why are we looking at federal Indian law and talking about the Constitution and jurisdiction? Because these cases are coming up every year in transportation and often go to the United States Supreme Court. Just recently in the past few years, we've had the Cougar Den case, which is a case with the Yakima Nation that made it clear to the United States Supreme Court it had to do with fuel tax issues and whether or not the tribe negotiated the right to travel. So in 1855, the Washington territories by Governor Stevens negotiated a treaty with the Yakima Nation. The Yakima, they had an extensive trade route from the coast down into Oregon and clear to Montana to trade for buffalo with the Blackfeet. And again, shellfish and coastal tribes, they traded these extensive territories. And they specifically negotiated in their treaty the right to trade, to bring their trade goods to market. And so, for many years, and again, I understand we're not in a federal Indian law class, but since the 1980s, American Indian tribes have lost more cases at the United States Supreme Court than you can even imagine. Felons and criminals had better success rates at the United States Supreme Court than American Indian tribes. However, recently, tribes have been able to be successful in a few cases at the United States Supreme Court. And I truly believe that it's because the justices are from, there are a few that are from Western United States. And so they understand federal Indian law. They understand how to apply these rules and these jurisdictional issues. And just to give you a little bit of context, tribes were at a great disadvantage when negotiating these treaties. So it's very hard for tribes to clearly understand what they were agreeing to. And of course, many US government officials were not very honest about their dealings with tribal communities. So we have these cases still going to the United States Supreme Court. And hopefully we can talk about a few of these at the end of the presentation. So here's was the Yakima Den case. It was the Yakima Reservation. Large land-based tribes, 1.2 million acres. In Oregon, you have a number of large land-based tribes. You have smaller tribes as well as larger based tribes like the Warm Springs. I am the associate director of CERTCOM, the Small Urban Rural Tribal Center on Mobility, and we work across the Western United States. You can see here in green, these are the reservation lands. So anywhere you go in the United States, it's likely that you're going to be dealing with tribal jurisdiction issues, whether it's transportation or historic preservation or planning issues. It's really good to understand a little bit about federal Indian law and tribal communities and jurisdiction. We have planning students that are working on broadband and internet within tribal communities, and there's going to be lots of jobs in tribal communities. And I encourage you to look for and apply for positions with tribal communities. We are great people to work for. We're passionate. We believe in our culture and the ways of our ancestors. So I encourage you to consider working for a tribal community. This maps really shows the U.S. highways that are within our CERTCOM areas, the areas that we study. I just wanted to highlight a little bit of the research when we're talking about mobility and how people move through from cities to rural communities to tribal reservation communities. And our migration patterns, sometimes it's made through these major highways. Maybe we're jumping on a Greyhound bus, or we're traveling by a vehicle. But just to understand that these highways touch and come close to a lot of our tribal communities. So I won't spend any time on this, but we do a lot of research measuring the mobility and access and isolation of tribal communities, whether we're looking at access to healthcare or access to Walmart and fresh foods. Often our tribal communities are food deserts, and we have to drive a long way just to get fresh produce. So you think about some of the locational characteristics, and it really varies among reservations a great deal. Sometimes you may have to drive 285 miles to get to a metropolitan population center, like the Fort Belknap Reservation. And there are other very isolated communities, the Southern Ute Reservation. It might be 210 miles from the nearest U.S. interstate highway. So these pose transportation challenges, and we do that research to highlight some of the disparities. You see that there are also very urban communities. We have the Cowlitz and the Puyallup tribal headquarters that are located with the 1 to 3 miles of metropolitan areas. So there's a lot of variability in Indian country. Some of the reservations are farther, to access grocery stores or interstate highways. We do a lot of work in tribal communities. We do focus groups. Sometimes I load my students up in vans and we drive 3 hours out to, let's say, the Cobble Indian Reservation, OMAC, and we work with tribal communities. Maybe we're at a tribal elder center. Again, I grew up on the Indian reservation, so I'm very familiar with a lot of the tribes in the inland Northwest. I also have cousins down at the Warm Springs Reservation. I'm going to talk about some stuff, and it's a little bit, it's tough to talk about human trafficking and sex trafficking. So I just want to warn you, if you need to step away, please do that. If you need to stop the presentation, then please take care of yourself. It can bring up some powerful emotions. So murdered missing Indigenous women. The National Crime Information Center reports that there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. And this is from the FBI's NCIC. The U.S. Department of Justice Missing Persons Database, name us, at that same time only logged 116 cases. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has reported that murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women. The rates of violence on some reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average. Urban Indian Health Institute, the Seattle Indian Health Board did a very comprehensive study, and I refer you that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. when you look at partner violence and sexual violence, there was a survey completed, and it told us that 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, 84%, have experienced violence in their lifetime. 4 out of 5. 56% have experienced sexual violence. 55% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. 48% have experienced stalking. 66% have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. And the survey found that 1/3 of all American Indian women will be raped in their lifetimes. You know, it was the National Institute of Justice that really funded the analysis. And how do you find this information? They looked at death certificates. They looked at urban areas and in reservations. You know, Native women are murdered at a rate more than 10 times the national average of other females. So, as I mentioned, I served at the tribes as the Spokane Tribes attorney. And during that time, I supervised the prosecutor, and we worked really hard to hold perpetrators of rape, domestic violence, and child molestation accountable. We worked through law and order code changes that really required that sometimes they were antiquated, and they had provisions requiring us to improve enticement. That means not only prove that the molestation happened, but they entice them with a video game or candy or something. And so our law and order codes have evolved, and we worked with forensic interviewing specialists like Casey Family Partners Services so that our interviews would hold up in court. Nevertheless, we continued to get declination letters from the United States Attorney's Office. We witnessed extreme cases of rape, sodomy, and extreme violence in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they declined to prosecute. Even there was one severe case where a tribal member was sliced ear to ear, nearly slicing her throat, and it required 72 stitches. So we want to improve the safety of tribal women, and hold perpetrators of DV accountable, enacting reforms on federal crimes to enhance the jurisdiction over crimes of domestic violence. We want tribal protection orders to be recognized by other courts because sometimes they don't. Amendments to federal assault statute, and different ways that we can improve safety for women in tribal communities. Enforcement agencies need to work to hold perpetrators of domestic violence accountable. And this was a statement by Thomas Pirelli. Again, we have a need enhanced jurisdiction in tribal communities. A tribe's ability to protect women from a violent crime should not depend on her husband or her boyfriend's race. I understand that sometimes it's the reverse, and the females are the perpetrators, and the men are the one receiving the abuse by their partner. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on the violence that is perpetrated against women. It is immoral for Indian women, Indigenous women, to be left vulnerable to violence because her abusive spouse is a non-Indian, and that's the current status of the law. So we look at some of the research that was completed by the Urban Institute, Urban Indian Health Institute. There they have a tribal epidemiology center. We look at the rates of violence against Native women living in urban areas. You know, there's a mixed number, whether it's 65% that live in urban areas. It depends on if you include the small towns. The American Indian population in 2010 reports that 55% are rural and small town, and almost half are living in urban areas. So the Urban Indian Health Institute really tried to understand the data and the violence, and looking at how law enforcement agencies are tracking and responding to cases, and how the media is reporting on them. So just try to understand some of the institutional practices. And with Indigenous women, we go missing 3 times: once in life, once in the media, and then again in the data. So we're trying to drill down and understand some of these issues. What I want to share with you a little bit today is Indigenous mobility. So if you look at the history of the United States government and federal policies that affected where tribal people live, there were a number of federal programs that brought Indigenous people into cities. For example, in the 1950s, forced relocation from the reservation to urban areas. And it really promoted, it was promoted by members of Congress to prepare tribal communities for termination. So they were relocating Indigenous people to the cities. Termination policies. This is a policy where the United States government, once they had all the land, once they had all the power, that they wanted to eliminate their responsibility, their trust responsibility that they bargained for in the treaty process. This policy eliminated government recognition of tribes. They wanted to sell tribal land, and after they took almost all they could, they wanted to terminate their responsibilities. A big tribe in Oregon that you guys are familiar with is the Klamath tribe. The Klamaths were very competent. They were smart, capable people. They had the big redwood forests. They had amazing resources. So they were targeted by the United States government and by Congress for termination. And in fact, they were successful in terminating the Klamath tribe. Of course, the tribe has now been re-recognized. And I'm pleased that I have lots of Klamath friends, and I'm honored in that friendship. But understand, when Indigenous people were moved to the cities, there were barriers to obtaining quality housing, education, employment. They left the reservation for jobs, and because they had poor geography on the reservation, typically the settler colonial pattern was to take all the best lands. And then when gold or something was discovered, then they rushed in and took those Indian lands. So tribal people were left with the lands that nobody else wanted. For OATS today, I really want to share with you a map that I had one of my graduate students make for me. It really illustrates relocation. So again, the relocation was in the 40s and 50s. My grandparents lived in Seattle. My mom was born in Seattle. They worked, during the war years in urban centers to support the country's efforts. My mom was born in Seattle. So this map, you can see that Alaska natives were often sent to Seattle. Washington state natives were relocated to San Francisco, Oakland, or San Jose. The Minnesota tribes may have been relocated to California. The Dakota tribes sent to Los Angeles. The New Mexico tribes sent up to Chicago. Understand that these tribal people were used to a particular climate. They had knowledge of the land base. They had a language and culture in their tribal communities. When they were relocated to these urban centers, it caused a lot of social systems to break down. I had friends from the Calvo Nation. One of my grandma friends, Loretta Pacotis, talked about her and her family being relocated to California, to San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose area. It was very difficult for them, but they actually spoke English as well as their tribal dialect. They knew of Navajo couples where when the husband went to work, the Navajo wife would cry all day because she only spoke the Navajo dialect. So this was very much a social shock. If you think about the Alaskan natives, here's these most capable hunters. They can skin out seals and live off the tundra in these extreme weather conditions. But to be relocated into Seattle, that's a challenge. One of the BIA agents said that there was an Alaskan native, the relocation, they told that Alaska native, if you have any problems, just call me, and so he called the BIA agent, and the BIA agent said, okay, well, where are you at? They in Seattle, where are you at? He said, I don't know. And he said, well, what is it? The sign say on the corner. And it said, and he said, it says walk and don't walk. Now that might be silly to us. But if you're somebody who that grew up in the tundra out in the village, you're not going to understand street signs and city systems. And so this relocation was very hard on tribal people. When we talk about mobility, reservation communities and tribal communities have very strong ties to our culture, to our families. And so even if we're relocated to cities, we often migrate and navigate back to our tribal reservations. So I also sit on the board of the board of directors for the American Indian Community Center. And we are located in Spokane. And when we look at the clients that are in Spokane, they come from all of these reservations. So when you're thinking about mobility, tribal people go back and forth between their reservation and urban centers for many years. Thinking about tribal mobility and patterns of travel, think about how do you interact? Maybe there's vulnerable communities. And for Indigenous people, we travel practice routes that our parents traveled, that our grandparents traveled. We have tribal mobility patterns, and they're not random. Traditionally, we are fully expected to visit our elders. This middle picture is my youngest daughter. She's going to be turning 18. This is her visiting with her grandpa. This picture on the right is my oldest daughter. She is visiting with one of our tribal elders that beaded her buckskin dress. So we are traditionally expected to be with our elders and participate in ceremonies and contribute to our tribal communities. We have ceremonies and things, giveaways and things that we go back and forth to our reservation and then back to our urban centers. Really, it's current systems of travel that are not keeping our women safe. And that's why I want to share with you, as transportation planners, as transportation professionals, I want to help provide transportation to vulnerable populations such as Native women. So even when you think about women in general, the mobility of women, there was recently a survey done in Los Angeles. Women who use public transportation more often make multiple stops. So just understanding how women travel, 61% of women's trips on all modes were 10 miles. Women are more likely to live in a car-free or car-light household. So we're dependent upon transportation. We ride more public transportation than men, yet transportation is still typically designed for men. So understanding the mobility of women. One of the largest barriers to riding public transit for women in the LA region is I don't feel safe. So safety, again, is a large issue for women that are traveling on public systems. And often women still have lower wages and live in poverty. So buying a bus pass, that bulk purchase, is harder to come up with that bulk of money than just being able to buy an individual pass as we need it. So when we think about the safety of Indigenous women, we think about tribal people having unique mobility patterns, that we travel from the reservation to the city and back for family and ceremony. We're connected with other tribal communities. Sometimes there's been hitchhiking. So just an example that I often give is my son goes to the University of Washington. And once when I was bringing him to the bus station, we don't have a lot of money. So I was bringing him down to the Greyhound for him to catch his bus. There was an Indigenous woman that was at a Greyhound. I'll say her name is Ivory. She was stranded in Spokane. She had been up on the Kalispel reservation, and there was an altercation. The boyfriend's family dropped her off. She didn't know anybody. Her phone had gone dead. She was trying to buy a bus ticket, and her mom had been on the phone with her credit card, because often in tribal communities we deal with cash systems. Because of the complicated land tenure, we often, most of the time, most reservations don't have banks, so we still deal with cash systems. We have tribal IDs, not state IDs. So these are all issues that prohibit or inhibit mobility. So again, just thinking about some of the statistics, half of the Indigenous women experience domestic violence. Many DV perpetrators are not Native. We have no jurisdiction over non-Indians. 67% of the child abuse cases are thrown out by the U.S. Attorney's Office. I personally was involved with one molestation case where we had a forensic interview, and the child disclosed that the molester was yanking on his private part, and the U.S. attorney declined prosecution. They said because the grandpa was on an oxygen tank that they likely would prosecute. Well, we don't care. We need these perpetrators prosecuted. So we see that Indigenous women and children are victims of domestic violence, of sexual assault, police brutality, trafficking, victims of trafficking. Some victims that are identified are pregnant, some are homeless, some are under the age of 18. And they're killed by their partners, sometimes by family members, sometimes serial killers, or sometimes drug dealers. 83% of the perpetrators were identified as male and half were non-Native. So as transportation professionals, we think about geography and we think about urban cities. Let's look at some of the highest cases. So states like New Mexico with cities like Albuquerque had the highest cases, 78 for the total in New Mexico, 37 in Albuquerque. In Washington, we have 71, with 45 of those being in Seattle. This scares the crap out of me. My daughter and son live in Seattle. Fortunately, my daughter is a black belt in Taekwondo, and my son is an all-city champion wrestler. So I worry a little less. But I now have another daughter that's going to begin college, so it worries me. Other cities that we look at: Arizona and Tucson, Alaska and Anchorage, Montana, the state Billings is the top city where people go missing. California, San Francisco, Nebraska, and Omaha. So again, these are some of the Indigenous women that have gone missing by the numbers, identified by the Urban Indian Health Institute. And these don't always, many times don't exist in law enforcement records. That's part of the reason that we are advocating so hard, is that we want people to look for our women and our Indigenous people when they go missing. So another story that I share with you is Idella. She was from Northern Arapaho Reservation. First, her family was relocated to Los Angeles and then eventually Seattle. As a young girl, her grandmother got a feeling. They were at the Yakima powwow, and her grandma just got a feeling, and so they packed up and they went back to their home in Seattle, and they found her auntie's body. Her auntie was deceased. The house was locked, and there was never really any investigation or explanation given to why her auntie had passed away. So later on in life, Idella went to study at the University of Montana in Missoula. She got a call about the death of a female relative, and this time it was her sister who died on the Wind River Indian Reservation. Her and her family drove to the Wind River Reservation to take care of her sister's affairs. Upon arriving, Idella really thought that she would find yellow tape. She had watched Law and Order and these crime movies, and so she thought there would be yellow tape around the scene. Come to find out that her sister's body had been left outside the hospital door. It just so happened that a nurse looked out and seen a body laying out there. The temperatures had dropped, and her sister was deceased. She never really did get answers about what happened to her sister. A few years later, Idella found herself also in an abusive relationship, and it was a violent dating relationship. This guy would come into her house and bust stuff up and beat her up. And when she would call the police, they would tell her that the laws of Montana really wouldn't adequately protect her, and that she should move to a jurisdiction that would do a better job at protecting her. And so she moved to Washington. So I want to explain to you some of the missing and murdered Indigenous women risk factors. Uh, and some of these are what professionals and academics call as social determinants of health. But first I begin with structural discrimination. As I've been explained throughout this presentation, there are legal processes and jurisdictional issues, public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations. If you look at even what Disney portrays as Native American, Pocahontas with her short dress and her off one shoulder off, bare shoulder off the shoulder sleeve, very bosom, curvy Pocahontas. Well, that's not how Indigenous women traditionally dress. We have cuffs, we have buckskin or cloth dresses that go up to our neck and clear down to our ankles with leggings and moccasins. Almost all of our parts of our body are covered. And so these cultural representations make Indigenous women more sexy and attractive. When you're talking about human trafficking, we're considered exotic. And so this, again, is part of the problem that we have in America. We have law enforcement norms where they dismiss Indigenous women as being alcoholics or drug addicts or prostitutes. I don't talk badly about law enforcement. I have family and friends that are police officers, but we've really got to change the mentality that any person missing is somebody that needs to be looked for. Again, as I have explained, we don't have banks on our reservations. That's very rare. So we work in cash systems. We have a lack of resources. There are individual factors that lead to murdered missing Indigenous women: poverty, no stable housing, no reliable transportation, educational levels, exposed to violence or sexual assault, addiction, sexual and physical and emotional abuse, mobility safety. Indigenous women are kind of tough. We grow up hard, and so we're a little bit on the kind of badass side. We're not afraid of things. And so sometimes we will hitchhike. Part of that mobility safety, that we leave ourselves vulnerable, because we're not going to wait around for somebody to take care of us. We're going to get stuff done. And sometimes we're walking down the road to get to an appointment, to get to someplace that we need to be. Sometimes it's even groceries for our kids. Disparities in opportunity, again, education systems, lack of employment, poverty. These are all issues in the tribal community. Violence, addiction, loss of land, culture, language, and identity. We very much have identity issues in our tribal communities. So I don't have time to go through all of the studies for, oh gosh, is that the correct time? Have we already gone through that much time? I don't have time to go through all, but there's studies out of Minnesota that talk about the risk factors that create vulnerability and victimization. Again, high rates of poverty and homelessness. There's lots of child sexual assault that the women that are subject to prostitution, they were sexually assaulted as a child, and so they might be prostituted, hunted, dominated, harassed, pimped, assaulted, or battered and raped. So it's really hard to understand tribal jurisdiction, but If there's a major crime like murder, rape, arson, tribes cannot prosecute that. The major crimes must be prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office and investigated by the FBI. So we are very dependent on outside sources to prosecute these major crimes. When we talk about human trafficking, it's hard to understand. Maybe it involves drugs and alcohol, and sometimes addiction leads to prostitution. But understand that there's historical trauma, there's boarding schools that disrupted family systems, the lack of trained parenting, foster care systems. Again, we have the 70s swoop where they took Indian children, from boarding schools in the late 1800s, through the early 1900s. There were boarding schools that loaded up Indian children, that loaded them up and took them away from their families. This disrupted family systems. Putting them in boarding schools often led to sexual abuse by priests, by adults, because there was nobody protecting those young children. So you have this molestation cycle that begins. And so these folks that were sexually abused grow up and abuse other people. Again, adoption, tribal identity issues, sexual violence. So there's all these issues with jurisdiction. No jurisdiction over non-Indians. We have shortage of law enforcement, poor relationship with local counties, complex jurisdictional issues. Sometimes there's prejudice and institutional racism. Major crimes, again, as if it's federal, the federal authorities must come in and investigate and prosecute. They decline. So I'm going to stop there. I have lots more information on human trafficking. And let me tell this one last story, and then I'll open it up for questions. So this is a case. There was a case in North Dakota where he was sexually abusing multiple young girls, coercing them to sell drugs, to perform sex acts for money. And then the case in Alaska, it was a charter boat captain that was getting young girls to, he would supply them with drugs. And these teenage girls, 4 of the 6 teenage girls were under the age of 16. In this case, it was very difficult to catch this charter boat captain, but there was a medical health professional that identified the same sexually transmitted disease amongst the victims. And so she was able to alert authorities, but it's because it was a partnership. We're working on a number of partnerships. And again, I'll stop there. With Washington State Patrol, we have tribal liaisons. Our students at the university, at Eastern Washington University, map the names and locations of murdered missing Indigenous women, and it leads to the tribal liaison assisting law enforcement in actually looking for the people that are missing. Let me stop share, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have. Brad or Sarah, were there any questions?
If you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself and going on camera, you can drop your question in the chat. Margo, I imagine that this was a lot for people to take in, especially if they're new to the topic. I want to thank you so much for being so thorough. I know I've heard often that there's not really anyone for folks who are being trafficked across, especially state boundaries, to call for help. And I'm curious what you think transportation advocates like us can do when people do reach out and are asking for assistance because they're on the receiving end of abuse, violence, intimate partner, stranger violence, or trafficking. Do you have advice for us as transportation practitioners?
You bet. You bet. In fact, I am working with WashDOT to set up some transportation training for folks, the maintenance staff that work at rest areas. The main thing is when you see something, say something. If there's a tent at a rest area or a motor home where people are going in and out, um, you just have to be aware. If it looks like young people are being forced to do something that's against their will, make a call to the authorities. If you see somebody who has some kind of markings, tattoos, uh, that sometimes they stamp them like ownership, tattoos on their body, like branding, if you will. And so when you see young people traveling in provocative clothing during the day when they should be at school, those are all red flags that in fact they might be being trafficked. So there's lots of stories where there was young Indigenous women at a local tribal park. Maybe she had gotten an argument with her mom and was de-steaming, and somebody came up behind her and put a bag over her head and took her clear to Mexico and trafficked her there. And this is a real story, of course. And they ran and they got to the border. And fortunately, the border patrol believed her, and so they let her call her family. And her family came from Montana and picked her up. So when you see something that doesn't look right, make a phone call. There's lots of trainings, truckers against traffickers. And if something doesn't look right, it doesn't hurt to make a phone call.
Thank you for that. Talia J had their hand up.
Hi, I want to thank you. This has been a really amazing presentation. I work in transportation for a consulting firm where we will do, among other things, plan for walking, biking, access to transit, and transportation safety. And we often do our work in rural communities that include tribal lands or tribal members. Are there particular things that we should do when we're planning for those transportation options that help make travel easier and safer for Indigenous women? Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to share also a book for transportation called Highway of Tears. My friend Jessica McDermott is the author, and it really brings home for transportation planners things that went wrong in the First Nations communities in Canada. There are all kinds of things. We can be really creative when it comes to transportation. On my reservation, we have a transit program called the Moccasin Express, and it goes from our tribal headquarters to the major, the small meeting points on our reservation, out to Airway Heights where they can get groceries. So just being creative about mobility and transportation. Sometimes it's just a slight change in the schedule that can accommodate, let's say, the family classes. If people have to go to drug and alcohol classes, or people have to go to some kind of adult education classes, or something, a small adjustment in the schedule can help parents get to where they need to go, so they can get their services. So just really thinking outside the box sometimes, being creative, and ask the community, ask what can help them. If people are trying to get clean and sober, then find a way to make that schedule work. So again, creative transportation solutions. And I also really recommend The Highway of Tears by Jessica McDermott.
Margo, there's a question someone sent via the chat that said, do you know of any specific training that transit agencies in the Columbia River Gorge could receive that would help them supplement the trafficking training that they're already receiving, especially that would be specific to tribal members living at the in-lieu sites or fishing access sites? They're trying to expand the reach of fixed route services for the tribal people who live at those sites along the river.
I'm guessing you're talking about training on trafficking preventative actions.
That's what it looks like. It says to supplement the trafficking training that they already receive.
There are a number of different videos. I would be willing to help set up a training. We are doing one for WashDOT coming up in May. And so maybe even contacting Mike Fucci at Washington Department of Transportation. They may be willing to share the links. We're going to do one specifically, Christian Joyner and myself, and they do a lot of training on what to look for, forced labor, forced sex trafficking, all those kind of things are things that we can be on notice of. And then again, I really like Truckers Against Traffickers. They have a number of resources. They have a mobile app that I highly encourage everybody to get a mobile app on Truckers Against Trafficking. It helps you to click if you see something and you call and ask, is this something that we should be looking out for? But if you see mobile homes at rest areas where people are constantly exiting and the curtains are all drawn, if it's suspect, then if your gut check, make a phone call.
Were there any other questions?
And I did just have a couple more slides that I would love to share if I could. Kind of bring us back up the positive. Oh, now it's not doing it. Okay.
You're shared. I can see it.
Yeah, but it's not. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
So again, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of prosecution challenges, foster care and homelessness. Today, attorneys are doing a better, U.S. Attorney's Office is doing a better job responding. Tribal communities have codes to protect. The Choctaw Nation says the victim shall be protected, that we will house the victim and not criminalize and penalize the person that's being trafficked. So there's lots of solutions. We need collaborative efforts across jurisdictions. We need U.S. attorneys to step up and prosecute. We in Washington State, we have two positions as tribal liaisons, one for the Western Washington and one for Eastern Washington. There still continues to be gaps. There's lots of work being done by the Seattle Urban Indian Health. But raising your young Indigenous girls in the culture, giving them strong self-identity. This is the Yakama Nation, and my friend Patsy Whitefoot works with the young Indigenous. They call them the Little Swans, where they work with these Indigenous girls. Next, Indigenous women are reclaiming our roles of leadership. This is Shelley Boyd and Deb Abrahamson, who are advocates for the environment. We have Indigenous women in Congress, right? We have Deborah Holland and Sharice Davids that were Indigenous women that were elected to the United States Congress. And of course, now Deb Holland, a Laguna Pueblo from New Mexico, is the Department of Interior, Secretary of the Interior. And Sharice Davids, she's a Ho-Chunk from Kansas. She's a total badass, right? She's mixed martial arts and an attorney. So we have these Indigenous women that are stepping up. Federal judges, Diane Humptiwa, that's Hopi. And so we have Indigenous women stepping up. We have medicine women that are continuing our traditional practices of our medicines that are healing. So all of these things really empower Indigenous women, bringing attention. This is my daughter with a red handprint over her face, symbolizing that we will no longer tolerate stolen sisters. So we are beginning to deal with issues of identity and find balance. And so, empowering Indigenous women. Now we have one on the United States Secretary of Interior, the President's Cabinet. Indigenous women are coming on strong. So again, I want to thank you guys all for participating in our webinar today. I'm happy to answer any other questions that people might have.
Were there any last questions for Margo before we lose her brilliance, expertise, and passion?
And it might not have seemed like it, but I tried to slow down a little bit for the sign language interpretation. I apologize that I speak so fast.
Margo, what's the best way for people to reach out to you and connect with you?
Probably by email, mhill86@ewu.edu. I'm a professor at Eastern Washington University. We have a whole tribal planning program. In our urban planning program, we have a master's in urban regional planning, but we have a tribal planning certificate where we teach Indigenous community planning.
Great, thanks. And Brad just dropped that in the chat. Margo, big claps. I know they're all virtual, so we won't be able to do a round of applause, but thank you so much for your amazing presentation and advocacy here. And I imagine some folks will be following up with you. And just a bit of housekeeping, I want to say thank you also to our sponsors who are listed on the SCED conference website, and to all of those of you who are participating in this last day of the 2021 Oregon Active Transportation Summit. Don't forget, 2 o'clock today, you can stop by and have some bingo with the outrageous drag superstar Poison Waters. It's going to be some time to just relax and engage each other in community as you head into the weekend. So thank you so much, Margo. Thanks to all of you for participating, and have a wonderful rest of your day.